Platformer franchises come and go over the years. Some have a pretty good lifespan like Mario or Sonic, who are still getting games to this very day. Some of them, while not very prevalent of getting games, are still very memorable, like Banjo for example. But among all the platformers over the years, most of them are either the human types or the cartoonish animal ones, but one of them is a bit more distinctive. Rayman, a video game character that was created by Ubisoft, a well-known European studio. The character's design was interestingly made due to limitations of the hardware. Originally, Rayman was going to have limbs, but unfortunately, due to limitations, they just couldn't animate his limbs very well, so they pretty much removed it, and that's how we got the floating arms and legs. Which ended up having very interesting ideas for the gameplay, like Rayman being able to punch through a distance. The game was first released in 1995 via the Atari Jaguar, although people are much more familiar with the PlayStation version that released only a few days after. With a few months later, the Sega Saturn and MS-DOS version did get a re-release. And when this game released, it received universal acclaim for its amazing visuals and gameplay. Not only that, but also Ubisoft made a lot of remixed or re-releases of Rayman 1, but in different ways. They made a level designer for Rayman for PC, there was some shitty edutainment games for Rayman. So yeah, there was a lot of versions of Rayman 1, but for this video in particular, we're actually going to be talking about the fan-made remake of the game, Rayman Redemptions. It's pretty much the same game, but with a lot of quality of life improvements, like in being widescreen and such, with improved level design. It's pretty much the definitive way to play Rayman, and it's free. The first ever Rayman game I've ever played was actually Rayman Origins. Not for the Wii, not for the PS3, or the Xbox 360, but for the Nintendo 3DS. Yes, this version, and honestly I did like the game. But as years go by, I understand that this is literally the worst way to play the game. I did eventually play the other games. I loved Rayman Legends and enjoyed Rayman 2 a lot, but I never really played the first one. But since I've been in a Rayman mood as of late, I thought why not to play some of his games. This is my first ever time playing Rayman 1, well for the remake per se, but with everything out of the way, let's get started. So the game starts with a peaceful land getting taken over by an evil entity known as Mr. Dark. He steals the Platoons, which cause the Electoons to scatter across the world. So it's now up to Rayman to stop Mr. Dark from causing chaos across the world. The story is very simple, but pretty charming, especially with the voice acting for the magician.
Hi, folks. You want to know what's going on? Let me tell you the story of Rayman.
And my favorite part of this is when Rayman shows up, and when they ask him to help save the world, he's just like, yeah, sure. But anyway, so for the gameplay. This game is very distinctive compared to other games released on the Atari or PlayStation consoles. With the power of those consoles, a lot of developers use it to make 3D games for the very first time. But for Rayman and certain other games, they use the power of the new consoles to make high-quality 2D games. And as for the controls, Rayman is very fun to move around with. Rayman can use his detached arms to punch people in distance. He can also use his hair to slow down his fall. All I should mention is that you're going to need to unlock these abilities in the original game, but in Rayman Redemption, you get them all in the beginning. Personally, I like this approach a bit more because when it comes to a 2D platformer, I prefer to have all the moves in the beginning and not unlock them. However, I should mention to make up for this, they did adjust some aspects so it wouldn't be too broken. Like for example, they emphasized the fact of these unlockable creatures you can find, which will add more platforming elements. It'll either add some rings you can swing on, springs you can jump on, and poles you can climb. There's also a great amount of variety of environments you can explore. Whether it's the luscious jungles of the beginning, or this entire world made out of instruments. I think my favorite world in this game has to be the area full of candy and such, because everything just feels very sweet and lively, mixed together with all the chaos that's been taken over by Mr. Dark. However, Rayman's not going in alone because he has some friends that will help him with certain abilities. There's these certain areas where Rayman will grab a bag of seeds, and every time he plants one, a plant will grow, giving him more elevation. In some of these levels, he will get equipped by this special glove where every time he punches, paint will be splattered across the wall where he can jump on. Which leads to very fascinating level design with it, especially when you have these little bouncy balls where every time Rayman punches it and moves around, you have to juggle between this and building a path for the ball. There's even one where Rayman can even just fly temporarily and try to go through these hazardous caves, while Rayman having this little cutesy face he has. However, even though this game looks very cutesy and all, it is not very easy at all. It is a surprisingly very challenging game. I was a bit confused on how the level design works in this game, but the more I played, the more I get used to it. So how the level design works is that once you enter a level, it's divided into 3 to 4 parts. So every time you try to clear a course, you didn't actually clear the level, but only a part of it. And as for the challenge of the level, as I said earlier, it is very challenging. There's a lot of enemies you need to avoid, a lot of do or die situations, and a lot of other aspects they'll ask you to go to a certain area so it can spawn different obstacles in later parts of the game. There's even more exclusive content to this game only for the Redemption version, which is pretty much a tribute to the weird spin-offs of Rayman, like the educational games, for example. With my favorite one being this math obstacle course where it's a rising floor level, but you need to solve the correct math problems to know where to go. Even the new boss fight in this game is pretty fun. Alright, I think I should talk about the bosses in this game. So when it comes to 2D platforming, I always feel like the bosses are usually the weakest point, but honestly, the bosses in Rayman 1 are pretty fun. They really remind me of the bosses you would see in Cuphead, especially with the later ones. And I also like how in the first world, there's 2 mosquitoes you need to fight, with Rayman preferring the first one, and the other one he just doesn't really care. Even the final boss takes a really cool concept where, since everyone has detachable limbs and such, they decided to shuffle everything around so you can have these little mixed chimera characters. This is also the hardest boss fight in the game because it took me literally an hour to defeat. Not even counting the obstacle course beforehand, because for the final areas, Mr. Dark has some hazardous gimmicks throughout. With one of them being that he will flip Rayman's movement around, and the other one, which is pretty much like the cosmic clones of Galaxy, there's a Dark Rayman that will chase Rayman throughout the level. And it gets really tricky throughout, especially with this final area where you have to rise this small elevator and you need to avoid overlapping with Dark Rayman because he will instantly kill you. If only I had one issue with the level design in Rayman, I feel like sometimes it could be a bit too aimless sometimes. Like there's this one section where it led to me to this really tricky platforming section, and after I try to get through it, it only leads me to the collectible, and honestly I thought it was the main goal. And there is certain issues with the original version that the Redemption version fixed. For one, in the original version, collectibles were mandatory to even beat the game, but luckily for the remake, they're just optional. And another thing too I love about the remake is that they have infinite lives in this game, because this may be an unpopular opinion. I feel like lives are a bit outdated these days. Because for a game like this, it's really required to have trial and error, and lives would just make things a bit more stressful. But honestly, the best part of the Redemption version is the brand new widescreen format, because wow, this game looks amazing. There's just something very elegant about pixel art styles during the 5th gen of consoles. There's just something very charming and innocent about the world of this game. And I also love the cute little dance he does when he beats a boss in the game. And another thing too about the game's presentation is the soundtrack, because wow, I really love it. There's something about the instruments I really appreciate about this game that honestly makes me think of Klonoa in some aspects. Because there's a lot of areas in this world that feels very imaginative. However, this only is the case for most of the other versions, but for the Atari Jaguar version, the soundtrack in this one is surprisingly very different due to space limitations. So yeah, that was Rayman, and overall, it's a pretty cute game. If you're very curious on this game, I highly recommend trying out the Rayman Redemption version. It's pretty much the definitive way to play it. It's in widescreen, it has quality of life improvements, and it's completely free. Or if you want to play the very original one, you can always play it on the PC or the PlayStation 1 version. They're mostly the most accessible version I can think of right now. Or if you want to get more interesting, you could always try out the portable versions of these games. Honestly, it's kind of impressive they were able to do that on this console. So this is Rayman 1 on the Game Boy Color. It's practically the same game, but on a much more simpler console, which also includes very cutesy artwork for the opening, which honestly I do really like. Well, it's pretty much a simplified version of Rayman 1. And I'll be completely honest, as much as I thought this game was just going to be a much more worse version of Rayman 1, while it is kind of the case, I was honestly surprised how well this version held up. I think it's mostly due to the much more slower paced level design Rayman had in the game. And also, the camera is a lot more zoomed out compared to the other versions, where Rayman is a lot more smaller in this game compared to the original version. I still consider this as the weakest version of Rayman 1, but for what it is, for a very simple Game Boy Color game, it's honestly pretty good. It is also the nicest looking game I've seen on the Game Boy Color, so that's nice. And lastly, we have Rayman Advance, and there's only one thing I need to say about this version. Screen crunch. I mean, with the original version of Rayman, it was fairly zoomed in to the character, but here it is very, very zoomed in, even more than usual. So get ready to do some leap of faiths. But honestly, even with the issue with the screening, it's honestly still pretty impressive they were able to fit the entirety of Rayman 1 on the Game Boy Advance. Even though there's no really any purpose of going back into this unless you're very curious, it's still Rayman 1, which means that this is still a pretty solid game. And the best part is that Rayman is just getting started. So for the next video, we're going to jump into the third dimension for Rayman's first ever 3D outing, Rayman 2, The Great Escape. But that'll do for today, so thank you for watching and I'll see you later. Bye bye!